is finding the needle in the hardware haystack, discussion of identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities via a hardware reverse engineering process. My name is Tim Wright, work with American Electric Power. This is Stephen Hollis. We're going to kind of walk through our slides a little bit for you guys. Real quick before we start, and if you guys feel uncomfortable answering, that's cool. How many organizations here, people here actually do any type of hardware or embedded security testing or reverse engineering? Anybody here, raise your hand, have you ever done that before? So I can get a kind of feel for who's doing it. A couple people? Okay, cool. Well, this is going to be a talk about debuggers. No, I'm just kidding. No, we're kidding. We kept it a little higher level to kind of talk about process, and so I'm going to walk through this, but enjoy. So again, who are we? I'm Tim Wright. I'm the team lead for American Electric Power. Currently, my role, I focus on pen testing, threat emulation, hardware reverse engineering with American Electric Power. 19 years of security experience, mostly offensive security experience. Member of a research group called Nullbyte, and we have a website, it's on the slides, nullbyte.com with 2 1s, and you can learn more about us out there. You can also hit me on the Twitters at redteam_hacker.
Hi everybody, I'm Stephen Holvis. I work for Pre-Talent as a cyber researcher, currently focusing on reverse engineering hardware, embedded hardware systems. I've had about 6 years experience with reverse engineering and IT security. I'm also a member of the independent security team Nullbyte, and I'm on Twitter as Gino Nullfree.
So what's the focus of this talk today? What are we going to be hitting? So we're going to talk about reverse engineering of embedded systems and hardware and why we think it's important that you guys should be doing that for part of your security program. We're going to talk a little bit about the state of hardware and embedded security and reverse engineering. And really, we're going to try to sell you why we think you should be spending time and resources looking at this. We're also going to be talking about a standard that we've developed to do this type of work in hardware and embedded systems. And we're putting it out there for feedback from the security community because currently I've been looking and I am not seeing a standard for doing this. And then we also, this is something that we do, that we love, and so we're kind of passionate, we want to learn more, and so we're pushing ourselves to kind of learn more about this market, this area, and what better way to do that than push yourselves to give a talk. So a little background. So embedded systems and hardware is not a new security problem. With the number of devices that are being deployed into organizations now that we consider embedded, it's blowing up. We're seeing a lot more of these devices hitting our networks. We're also seeing a development of microcontrollers, powerful microcontrollers in a very small footprint. Arduinos, Raspberry Pis are an example. And so we're seeing more power and a smaller board, right? And so vendors are developing more systems based on those controllers. And so as a result, we're seeing a potential vulnerability start to get introduced into these organizations. We're also seeing a shadow IT, or BYOD, where people are just buying things. They see something they think is cool, going out and buying it. They want to solve a problem in their organization. And security or IT is never a concern. They're fixing it themselves. They'll go out to Best Buy, they'll purchase something, they'll bring it in, they'll deploy it. And with these devices, it seems like all of them are hitting the web now, right? They're all pulling content or pushing content to the internet, getting their updates. And so with that, communication opens a new vulnerability. So all of these are issues, we think, with these devices. So the problem here is that we're not seeing standards for doing reverse engineering on embedded systems. There are a lot of companies out there that are offering this as a service. It's kind of like pen testing was years ago, where it's the secret sauce. You have a couple guys in a team, they know how to reverse engineer hardware, but ultimately it's whatever they think needs to be done is what's being done. So it's harder for us as security engineers and managers to scope this type of assessment. So this has become like the secret sauce, right, for these organizations. So truthfully, this having a standard defined will help us as organizations as we look at doing more of this work, asking these companies to come in, having some type of baseline established. So this slide here, what I tried to do with this slide was try to give an example of standard network penetration test versus hardware security assessment. So on the left, you see a network infrastructure, your Windows servers, domain controllers, clients, etc. When you do a full scope pen test, usually all of that is going to be within your scope. Have a team of guys going out and doing discovery, vulnerabilities, discovery, exploitation. Where the image on the right, we have an embedded device sitting on a workbench, and we pulled that device apart. And really what we're doing is we're trying to look at the firmware on that device, what kind of interfaces are on the device, specifically trying to identify and figure out the functionality, what's going on under the hood. And as you can see, the scope of the assessments are totally different. So the network pen test, a lot more stuff out there. The hardware assessment, much smaller scope, maybe one device, two devices, etc. So that's where we think the difference between the two lie. And doing the hardware assessment, findings from that may feed into the pen test, but it's a specialized, different skill. So we're not the first guys to actually come up here and talk about embedded hardware, reverse engineering. There's a lot of research online about this. The guys at Zippiter have a great website and blog. They develop some tools, and they have a lot of training that they've done out of Black Hat. And I'm a fan. Steve's a fan of their website. We're spending a lot of time out there reading their blog posts and seeing what they're doing. There's also a lot of guys that have presented talks on this from Black Hat, DEF CON. Daryl, who's here, giving a keynote tomorrow. He's done a lot of work with printers and Preda and SNMP. So a lot of people out there doing research on these systems, and we appreciate all the work they're doing. Just want to give you guys an example of who's actually doing some of this work. So this is not a new vulnerability, but we're starting to see an increase of disclosures. In this slide, we're talking specifically with SCADA. So as we see in 2010, 2011, as researchers started digging into these devices, we started to see a skyrocket in vulnerabilities being discovered in this. And it's not because the code is now getting worse. It's because we're putting more eyes into the devices and finding the broken code. And, 2013, 2014, 240 disclosures in some of these devices, and this is just SCADA. So if we haven't looked at some of those older devices on our infrastructure, those vulnerabilities are still sitting there. So some of the risks that we're seeing, some of the things we feel that your organization could be at risk of: data exfiltration, using loss of IP, using some of these devices to move data outside of your infrastructure, access to the network, so using the device itself, if it's connected to the internet, having an attacker compromise that and using it as a bridgehead into your infrastructure. Physical damage. So some of these SCADA ICS systems, they're very tender. It doesn't take a whole lot to take them offline or even damage these devices, and so we've seen some of those attacks actually destroy these devices. Modification, so the system could be damaged. There could be data tampering within the system or system alteration. And then finally, theft of service. I don't know if anybody remembers, but back in the day, you could modify satellite systems, a satellite TV, clone the card and steal satellite service just with a basic gear. So having the device unlock functionality that would be a charge to your organization, something that your company would be making money from, that would be a loss to service or theft of service. So some of the vulnerabilities that we've been seeing, and some of the research we're doing, and some of the stuff we've done in our office, and there's more. This is not a complete list, but these are some of the ones that been seeing over and over. Stack overflow, code execution, or denial of service vulnerabilities. Undocumented backdoors in the system. Physical compromise via console or debug interface. So a lot of these boards have JTAG or UART interfaces that you can connect into physically. Wireless protocol compromise, weak crypto, weak firmware management processes. So if you have a management updating process in the device, we've seen that can be tampered with. And then finally, the web interface devices. And so I'm going to walk through these. So Stack Overflow, code execution, and denial of service. A lot of these devices are running on an embedded Unix or Linux. And so we're seeing a lot of these applications are developed in C or C++. And if you don't write your code properly there, you can actually have these Stack Overflow vulnerabilities. And so either whether you can control that vulnerability or if it's a denial of service, the end result is you can either get code execution or knock the machine offline. And so we've seen quite a few of those. Undocumented backdoors in systems. So this is, again, the Unix operating system underneath. If the root account or some of the accounts that are actually on the operating system have not been removed and the passwords have been left to default, then what that can allow is an attacker to either connect in with Telnet or SSH, gain remote access into the device, and then they have a pivot onto your infrastructure. Physical compromise via the console or debug interface. Again, this is somebody popping the hood off. They have physical access to the device, connecting into those ports, making modifications to the operating system running on the device. This is something where we feel if it was somebody who was in the supply chain, they could compromise the supply chain, put malicious code on the device if they were motivated to do so, or even if somebody got into a physical site and modified the device. Wireless protocol compromise. So this is everything from 802.11 to 800 megahertz radio to cellular. Being able to compromise the device remotely over a radio frequency, monitor communications on the device, and get some kind of remote command execution on the device via wireless. Weak crypto, and this is kind of I've seen this in a couple devices too. The default SSH keys are weak SSL. Default SSH keys, if you can find that the vendor is using the same SSH keys on the device, and those can be compromised, then any device that's hitting the internet you can SSH into and get access into the device. With the weaker SSL, you can actually, if the device is negotiating for a weaker crypto algorithm, then you can potentially do man-in-the-middle attacks, data manipulation, that sort of thing on the device. And then weak firmware management process. So unprotected interfaces, whether it's a web interface or a USB on the device, if somebody can tamper with that, you can patch your firmware, upload a new firmware image into the device, and then have that device do malicious things or act as a bridgehead on the network. And we've seen an example of this. We're going to talk about that here in a second with the Black Energy malware and some of the things that happen there.
Can you go back one, please? So for the weak firmware management, we found that it's often an undocumented process for an organization to have any firmware management. Usually there is none, right? So the firmware on the devices are either never updated once they're deployed, or they can be so easy to update that any user on the network could do it. They could just either plug in a USB drive and hit the reboot button or whatever, or hit the web interface and just upload it. So it's usually one or both of those.
Right. Web interface attacks. So a lot of these devices have a web management interface. If you think of a Soho Linksys router or something like that that's sitting on your home network, those interface attacks are going to be your standard OWASP type vulnerability, SQL injection, cross-site request forgery, remote file inclusion, stuff like that. And so we've seen a lot of these interfaces that are not really coded well, and you can bypass access controls, access admin features directly just by calling the URL without actually authenticating into the device. And so if these devices are sitting out on the internet, using tools like Google or Shodan become very trivial to find these interfaces and attack them. So this is something that I think a lot of researchers have been showing more and more of, these weak interfaces. So we're going to walk through some risk examples.
I'll take over. Cool. All right, so we got a few here. Recently, the Seagate NAS was found to have a hard-coded, undocumented account set to root as the username and root as the password. So anybody that had web access to this device could just log in. They have full admin creds. They can enable the telnet service. They can then use the device as a pivot on the network, and they can do some nasty damage with that. The Moonworm, this one was also another recent exploit that's been going around, hitting the web, attacking the web management interface on the Linksys routers. This one would generally cause either denial of service or degradation of service over the router itself. And also we have some nice integrated Bluetooth controlled toilets with the automatic flushing and deodorizing feature, which is of course a must. So we wanted to get one for the lab, but we couldn't afford it. So TrustWave has done some research on it and found that the hard-coded pin basically allows anyone with Bluetooth within Bluetooth range to be able to connect to the toilet, which then you can activate the built-in bidet function on command. So, yeah. So, but it's fine because Bluetooth is of course short range. Well, you know, if you go out and build a Blue Sniper, then you can hit it from up to a mile away. Yeah. So, and also we have the Black Energy malware, which is we found Mike Tyson endorsed apparently.
It's a black.
It's an energy drink. It just we Googled image search for the picture, and that one came up. We had to include it. So this malware was actually pretty bad. It left 225,000 people in the dark in the Ukraine. So what it did was it didn't attack the embedded hardware devices per se, but it attacked the Windows PC controller that was used to control all the ICSs in serial devices. So it hit the Windows computer through a phishing attack, and then they sat on the network, they gathered intel, they figured out what devices were connected and how to talk to these devices, and then they ended up sending a remote shutdown to all the devices. And right after they did that, they did a kill disk command to wipe the Windows hard drive, and then told the computer to reboot. So of course now all their Windows systems are down. They have no way to control these devices except manually going out to substation and substation, physically throwing the switches back on. Yeah, so that one was pretty rough for them. So we believe that the risk in this area justifies the work. We've seen some examples. There are many, many more examples that we haven't even touched on. And the recent trend is these are getting more and more common, and they're getting worse and worse. So the bad guys are doing this research. We need to be spending time, money, and energy doing this research as well to protect ourselves, because otherwise we're just throwing, possibly malicious devices onto our own network. So we need something more than just a risk assessment on these devices. We need something that's tangible, right? So how are we going to do this testing? So first of all, before we can even do the testing, we have to define the process. So this is the part where we are reaching out to the community and asking everyone to come together and let's figure out the correct or the best way to do this kind of testing, so that we can have a measurable and repeatable process that we can use across different types of hardware, embedded hardware, all sorts of things, routers, whatever. This would give us more than just a vulnerability scan. So based on this reasoning, we are proposing the hardware reverse engineering standard, the HRES. So we've based it on the 7 main points of the PTES, which is the penetration testing execution standard. But it's different. It's different, guys. So we're calling on the community to help us create this standard for hardware reverse engineering of these devices. So we want it to be a complementary fork of the PTES, where we're not focusing so much on the overall network, but on a specific device. And so the process itself is similar, but it is different in how we attack each of these devices and figure out what it's actually doing underneath. So let's get into the HRES process.
Good job, Brian. So one of the things I want to stress too is that the PTES, all the guys that did the work on developing that process, such an awesome framework, and they really kind of laid the groundwork for what we're proposing here. So mad respect for those guys and all the stuff that they've done. So the 7 main sections of the PTES, the pre-engagement, intelligence gathering, threat modeling, vulnerability analysis, exploitation, post-exploitation, and reporting, we're kind of proposing the same thing for the 7 sections of the HRES. And we felt that that whole process mapped really well. Now it's the subsections, I guess, the actual processes underneath are going to be different in some sections. Some of those are going to map directly, and we're going to kind of talk through that a little bit. So we put together a basic mind map here of some of the things we felt like we do during one of these assessments. And again, when we start looking at things like the pre-engagement interactions, developing the ROE, that sort of stuff, it's straight from the PTES, right? And those guys did an excellent job. But when we start looking at vulnerability analysis or exploitation, that's when we start looking at things like bypassing anti-tamper mechanisms, doing a firmware analysis, connecting to the chip, doing soldering, those sorts of things. So those were the sections where we felt it wouldn't be a one-to-one mapping to the PTES. We felt it would be a standalone process and needed its own process based on the PTES. But before we dig into that, let's real quick just say we're going to give a safety banner here. As we're doing this testing, this stuff, if you're doing dynamic analysis, you're looking at the device as you're running it, make sure you're safe. These devices are powered, and so reaching inside of them, if you're not careful, you can get hurt and potentially killed by messing with power. So one of the things that AEP is real big on is safety. So as a community, we want to make sure that nobody gets hurt while we're doing this. So if you have any questions or you are in doubt, ask someone. Don't just assume and reach into a device and get hurt. So put that out there. So first, let's talk about the pre-engagement interactions. So some of the things that were different that we're talking about here versus doing a standard network penetration test, we're going to ask for a set of devices that we can do testing on. This is going to be a device for doing constructive testing, and destructive testing is kind of what we're calling that. So for our constructive testing, that could be things where we're fuzzing the web interface, we're doing port scans, we're testing a proof of concept code or exploits that we're going to fire against a device that is straight from the vendor. The destructive testing is where we're actually going to pull the device apart. We're going to reverse engineer, take components apart, desolder, that sort of thing. And doing that process, you could damage or destroy the components. So that's why we're asking for a set here in case we do let the magic smoke out. We have another device so we can still do some type of testing on. Also want to make sure we have clearly defined testing goals while we're setting up the ROE, just so that we know what we're trying to prove here. So if we're just looking for remote code execution vulnerabilities or testing for denial of service, let's put those inside the pre-engagement. Also, as we're going through and we get everything signed, this is a time where we can define time to set up our workbench or our lab. So we have specialized tools in this area, and we need to get those set up and configured. That's when we're going to set that as well. And then finally, one of the things we want to make sure is when you're testing these devices, if there's specialized debuggers or programmers that we have to get from the vendors, there could be some lead time in getting those from them, and I've had some experience in dealing with that. So you're going to want to make sure that if there is a wireless or RF type of connector or an IR connector you need to connect into the device, request all that stuff from the vendor while you're getting the gear. I included this in the slides because I thought it was kind of interesting. This is United States Code Title 17, Section 906, where it pretty much states by law we have a right to reverse engineer hardware if we're teaching or doing it for education purposes or doing testing on a device. That doesn't mean we can clone chips or whatnot and sell the intellectual property. But what that means is, as security engineers, we have a right to pull the case apart and look at what's going on under the hood. Now, Steve and I are not lawyers, and we are not claiming to be lawyers. But what we're saying is, if you want to do this, go back to your company and point to this piece of law and say, hey, does this give us the right to do this type of testing? And if so, then we can put that in our testing policy to make sure that we're covered. So our intelligence gathering phase. So now we start getting into where we're going to start looking for the spec sheets for our motherboards or our chips. We're going to photograph the device before we start taking it apart. And I don't know about anybody here, but I can't put something back together when I take it apart because I forget how it all goes back together. I usually have a handful of screws left over. So the photos actually help putting the stuff back together as you're taking it apart in stages. Next, we're identifying the chips that are on the board. If it's an SOIC chip or a PDIP or something like that, you can take a piece of graph paper, write it on a graph paper, and have a simple drawing all the way up to having a piece of software where you can map all that. And using tools like a multimeter to identify the power, ground, or data pins on the board. Testing looking for the test interfaces on the board, so if you have JTAG or UART, something like that. Identifying the wireless chips on the board to see if you have 802.11, Bluetooth, Zigbee, things like that you need to test during the assessment. And then finally looking for anti-tamper. So if and more of government stuff, you're going to see anti-tamper devices being built onto the board. But there could be lock bits or glitch detection built into the board, so you need to be aware of that and just plan for it accordingly. And then, real quick too, so some of the intelligence gathering, and I think we'll get to that later on, but we've used some of the FCC site to identify wireless chips that are on the board and actually get the specs for those. And Stephen did some of that. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, the FCC database is really awesome. We've actually found entire manuals on these devices on their database. So if any wireless-enabled device will be required to have an FCC ID on it. So you just go to the website, put in the ID, and it'll pop the device, and you'll be able to get some good information on it.
So threat modeling. So in this phase, a lot of the threat modeling, you can actually identify the inputs, outputs, what the device is doing, and kind of build your testing accordingly. But I also put in here, too, that we can use threat modeling if you have a smaller team and you need to prioritize your work based on risk. You can use something like a Carver model to actually help you identify where your most risky components you want to start your testing on, right? So, I know a lot of testers want to chase the shiny, but we also want to make sure that as an organization we're getting the testing done. So we can go through our Carver model. I have 3 examples up here. Customer billing data being sent unencrypted over a mesh network, gas meter at a customer site with an RF interface, and remote access into a support system via substation wireless AP. Depending on your business, could define which one of those are more risky to you. So with a Carver, you can actually help identify and prioritize based on the risk for your organization. And so I don't know if anybody probably most everybody in here has seen a Carver before. We put this on here just kind of help us risk rank, and I put a URL on the slides to help you read more about Carvers if you've never done that. But I use Carvers, and it really helps make sure that we're focusing on the higher risk stuff first. So now phase 4, vulnerability assessment. This is where we're going to get into doing some soldering, connecting jumpers. We're going to be extracting firmware from our SPI chips. We're going to actually test our access levels via I2C or JTAG, something like that. See if we can connect directly into the board and get a root shell. A lot of times getting root on these devices is as simple as plugging into an interface on the board, and I got root. And it's like, okay, well, we're done. We can sniff data from the bus using a logic analyzer to see exactly what's going around the bus as the device is booting. We can record and process wireless data as we need to. And then if we're connecting into the wireless network, we can look for other devices that maybe are sitting out there that we didn't know about if we're looking at a production infrastructure. And then reverse engineering the firmware using tools like IDAPRO or things like that to actually see what's going on within the firmware. So here's an example. We've got a SHRES-A connected to a wireless access point here. This is from Zipiter's website. And so they've used the SHRES-A, which is a USB interface, and connected right into, I believe that's a UART interface on the wireless adapter or the wireless AP. And they were able to get a shell on the box and actually interface with the operating system underneath the wireless AP, which was a variant of Linux. This guy is supported OS X and Linux out of the box, so you can just plug it in and your MacBooks will pick it right up, and then from there, using something like Minicom, you can connect right in using this interface to talk to the device you're testing. You want to talk about this one?
I'm sure everybody's played with the Raspberry Pi, but they are really awesome. They're really cool tools. I like to have one in my testing toolkit that I put my own reverse engineering system together, with all the software I want. And the GPIO pins are really cool. So it has SPI interfaces on it, as I2C, as UART, all on these pins. I know with Arch Linux ARM, you just have to enable a commented out feature in one of the boot files to enable the SPI interface, and then you can start talking directly to physical chips with it. It's pretty snazzy.
And it's really quick too. So using this board, you can put all your tools right on the Raspberry Pi under Linux, pull your firmware down on it, and then from there reverse right on the Pi. So it makes the environment, setting up an environment, really cheap and really quick, and you can get to moving pretty fast on some of these projects. So now we're talking exploitation. So in this phase, we're anything from physical to memory to wireless exploitation, the management system, all of that's in scope for us. So from this phase, we're looking to try to develop our proof of concept code, demonstrate code execution, or moving lateral within the infrastructure. This could be anything from looking for LDAP credentials on the embedded device to the hard-coded passwords we've been talking about, or SSH keys. I have not seen AV running on these devices. I don't know if anybody else here has done any testing on these, but AV is not an issue. So generally we're looking at network controls, firewalls, data diodes that we're going to have to bypass, access permissions, etc., to gain access into some of these other infrastructures. And really what it comes down to, if you need to, you can also look at social engineering as an attack vector in these devices. Most of the time we don't have to do that, but we put it in here just to make sure that we were being complete. So some examples of exploitation tools that you can use here is the Terminator framework. This framework was built to test smart meters, AMI networks, and it's just like Metasploit. So if you've ever used the Metasploit interface, it's just the same, except this targets the meters. It goes through the the IR interface on the front of the meters, connect in, and then you can actually send the commands and query the meters and that sort of thing. It implements the C1218, 1219 protocols for communication, and this is a really neat testing framework for testing these meters. And it seems like this has got a lot of support online from the community, so I don't think this is going away anytime soon. So post-exploitation processes. So we start getting into things where we're trying to enable persistence, moving lateral on the infrastructure, data exfiltration, and I think things we need to be looking at for the hardware is actually doing destructive testing on these devices too, seeing how resilient they are to someone actually banging up against them. And I know a lot of times when we do pen testing, especially when I do, we tend to not do denial of service testing on our infrastructures. But for these devices, I think it should be something we should be looking at more, especially with the destructive side, because of how these devices, where they're sitting, what they're doing. I think we need to be doing that type of testing. And then finally, pulling it all together and doing our testing report. So most of this stuff is straight out of the PTES. One thing I will say, though, is when we're talking with vendor devices and we're looking at potential zero-day attacks, you want to make sure you're building in an ethical disclosure process within your company so that you can work directly with the vendor, make sure they understand where their vulnerabilities are, and give them time to work on a patch. And again, this could be something that could be difficult, but depending on who the vendor is, they may not be very responsive. So you may have to let your management work through their chain to get this resolved. So don't lose hope that just because they're not fixing it in 30 days that they're not gonna. And so one thing we put in here too is when you're developing your findings, we want to use some type of risk modeling and not just leave it up to the pen tester to decide what's critical and what's not. I'm a fan of the DREAD model. It's a 5-tier model, critical, high, medium, low, and informational. This is the one I use for our reports. But using some kind of mathematical equation to actually formulate your findings so that the tester doesn't have to defend his findings or they're different from tester to tester, you're actually using math to kind of justify. And so an example here, a DREAD risk model. This was just one that I did from one of the things we put in the slides, the default root account. So damage potential, reproducibility, exploitability, affected users, and discoverability. And the wiki really kind of outlines each one of those, but then based on the finding, we put that as a 9.6 critical. But if you do this and you save it, you can actually have supporting evidence for each one of your findings. I think it's kind of a cool way of coming up with a risk model for your findings. So based on all of the research we've been doing and the things, we wanted to have the HRES be a repeatable, measurable process. We think we've got that. We're looking at the PTES and all the work those guys did there, and basing that as our starting point for developing this testing process. We think that by developing this, organizations can now start to dig deeper into their embedded and hardware stuff before it comes in the door, if we can find our users before they go out and actually buy the stuff. So we can test this and ensure that we're getting devices that are properly tested. And we're hoping that the community can help us define this further. So that's kind of our call to arms. So closing thoughts? Let's see.
So where do we go from here? I mean, we've seen from the slides that the risk is just getting greater and greater the more devices we bring onto our networks. Our security teams, as security teams, we should really be looking at these devices before they touch our network. So, as we said, we're proposing the HRES to help us define a measurable, repeatable testing process. So right now, we're in the process of setting up a website and a wiki, and getting the entire process outlined, and as well as expanding the mind map, as you can read. So our website will be HRE-standard.com. So we will announce when that actually goes live via Twitter. Yeah, soon. So thank you for your time, and so we'll open it up for any questions. I don't know if that's good or bad. So, all right. What resources or what do you recommend to start out?
That's a really good question. So we have some actual slides that are after this so we were slide hoarding, right? We couldn't figure out what to delete, so we were like, okay, we'll give the talk for 50 minutes, 45 minutes, and then if people want to hang out, we can talk more. So we actually have some slides talking more about tools and entry prices and getting to some of this. It could be as low as just a couple $100, a Raspberry Pi, a HRES-A, a multimeter, a nice soldering iron, and you could be really kind of doing some assessment all the way up to, if you have a company that has a decent budget, you could be looking at thousands of dollars if you get a nice oscilloscope, if you get a logic analyzer or something like that where you actually are monitoring the bus. So the entry level for some of this work can be very cheap. And there's some reasonable boards out there. The Jtagulator, Joe Grand's board, that's a really nice board for doing JTAG pinout identification. The Bus Pirate, which you can get online, I think it's like $35. That's a really nice board, and it comes with the connector, so you can actually get right into doing some of this work there. And then a lot of the tools are open source, so using something like Samurai STFU, which is a Linux-based ISO, just like Kali Linux. And most of the tools that I've used, I think all of them are in there. So you can just literally download the ISO, put it into a VM on your workstation, and from there start reversing. I will say this though, using some of the things like Benwalk, that doesn't actually pick up all the firmware. You may have to do a little coding. So there could be some learning curve there. But if you've got a community and friends that can support you, I think there's a way to get into it and not spend tens of thousands of bucks. So,
also the Zipiter blog is a really good resource to start with, as well as the Dev TTYS0 blog. They have some really good stuff on there.
And if you have training dollars, I know there's some really good training at Black Hat. Sex via Hex is out there, and that's the guys at Zipiter teach that class. That's software exploitation via hardware exploitation. That class looks amazing. I've never taken it, but I think it looks awesome. And there's some really good training that gets done at DerbyCon. I think Joe Grand gave his class last year at DerbyCon. It sells out super fast. And DerbyCon, amazing con for $1,000. I think you get the class and the badge. So there's ways of learning more about that too and doing stuff like that.